Hunters of Reddit, what did you see out there that made you not want to go back into the woods? One of my experiences happened on family-owned land in North Carolina where I used to live. I still hunt, so it never kept me from going again. We called it the noise. To this day, if you ask people who live or lived adjacent to the land about it, they know exactly what you were talking about. Whatever it is was very loud and very fast. It was like a very loud primal scream. First time I heard it, I was hunting with my dad and brother. We were stalk hunting and very slowly and methodically moving through the forest. I noticed everything had gotten oddly quiet. Only thing you heard was the water running over the rocks in the creek. My dad stopped us and said to hold still and not to move. As soon as we stopped, it screamed behind us. It was so loud it made my ears ring. My dad never showed fear and was always rational. He looked very nervous, and I'm ready to crap on myself. My brother has his gun shouldered, looking around trying to spot it just to see what it is and make sure it isn't close. Then it screams again. Now it seems closer and in front of us. My dad puts his hand on my shoulder and just says, "Run for the car now." I jump up like a scared rabbit and run as fast as my legs will carry me. We are all running, and we can hear this thing screaming as we run, like it's keeping pace easily. I can see the gravel road ahead and know the car is close. It lets out another scream that sounds like it's to my left now and very close. I bolt right, and we all come sliding out onto the road about 100 yards above the car. That's when I hear this weird whistle from the woods, and then everything just goes back to normal. Birds chirping away, squirrels calling, crows cawing. We stop to catch our breath and uneasily walk to the car, ready for anything. 100 yards never seemed so far away. That wasn't the last time I heard it. In fact, I have more stories that involve the noise. If anyone wants to hear about them, I will gladly share. My family tried to find it for years to figure it out. When we thought we were close, it would be somewhere else. Even trained hunting dogs ran away from this thing. Weird stuff, but I still love to hunt. The way I figure, if something gets me while I'm hunting, at least I'm doing something I love, and being close to nature, I harvest her bounty and thank her for it. One day my body will feed her and the animals I hunted. My father and I were following a trail for a while, so we decided to take a break and catch our breaths. I sat on a log off the trail, and my dad stood on the edge of the trail waiting for me to get up. I hear some movement and scan around, and I see a man, dressed casually, walking quickly down the trail with a Glock in his hand. He is not really following the trail, he is just walking toward my dad with haste. Before he comes up to my dad, he asks if he's seen anything. Pretty normal. I keep an eye on him because I don't believe he was there to hunt. I think he was there to make sure my dad hadn't seen anything he wasn't supposed to. He wasn't dressed like a hunter, he didn't walk like a hunter, and it was deer season, and he decided he would take his Glock out to get a deer. I wasn't buying, so I put a round in the chamber and watched them talk. He seemed to be confident until my dad mentioned that he was here with me and gestured in my direction. I nodded and made a half-assed wave. And he seemed to lose interest in us and ended the conversation shortly after and turned around and walked back the way he came, just about as fast as he walked up to us. It worried us a bit, but we continued on. We haven't been back to that area in a while. My dad told me that there have been drug busts near that area in the past. This isn't a supernatural tale, just an experience that made me not want to go back to that area. I've got one good one. I have a hunting spot that I frequent. Not crazy far off the grid or anything like that. Terrain is a pain in the ass, but it's a pretty hidden spot that is close to my house. Anyway, I hunt a lot of small game there and see a ton of mule deer anytime I go out. One morning I get there about 5:30 a.m. and have some time to kill before I start my hike in. I have an odd feeling in the parking lot, but just chalk it up to too much coffee on an empty stomach giving me anxiety. So, I decide to start hiking in, and about 300 yards into my hike I notice this pile of downed trees / branches / general debris that I hadn't seen before. It was my first time hunting this particular place this particular season, so I figure some folks came out and did some fire mitigation work. I don't pay too much attention to it until I notice there's an odd amount of movement coming from it. pretty small movements, but it sticks out when a brush pile is wiggling on a still day. It was also about 5:45 a.m., and the wilderness just sort of has this stillness to it at that time that any movement is noticeable. So, I stop and start examining the pile to figure out what's going on. I figure there's a rabbit in there, maybe some squirrels. I figure I've hit the jackpot and I'm definitely about to bag something. I start deciding the best way to flush whatever is going on in there and still have my shotgun up in time to take a good shot. I realize I'm standing by a decent-sized branch, and my best move is to just stomp on the branch. If all goes according to plan, everything will freeze, then whatever is in there will dart out. I try to figure out where the rabbit will come out of, get ready, and bam, I stomp on the branch and snap it in half. The pile goes still, and that stillness and quiet is back. Then, a mountain lion, with a bloody nose and mouth, pops up out of the pile. At this point, I'm about 10 yards from the pile. I have my shotgun, but really don't want to shoot the lion. I also don't want to fire a shot off in the air to scare it, because all in all this was a pretty cool experience that very few people get to have. It froze and was looking at me very quizzically. Then, in one quick motion it hopped out of the brush pile, ran uphill, got about 40 yards from me, and disappeared into the trees. I've never seen something cover 40 yards uphill in such a fast, graceful way. One of the cooler things I've ever gotten to experience. I went to check out the brush pile when it left, and sure enough it was feasting on a mule deer. Still my favorite out in the woods story I ever tell. When I was a kid, a poacher must have thought I was a deer or something and shot around at me. It impacted on a tree above my head. I immediately fired 3 shots as fast as I could, not at the shooter but in the air. In my hunting group, immediate 3 shots means elk basically. My dad and our hunting club immediately came out to find out what the hell happened by honking the horns of their trucks letting me know they were coming. I basically lay on the ground until I could tell they were near the dirt road. Told them what happened and guessed it was probably a road poacher trying to get a deer as it came from the same road. They didn't see him. It was private property and we were always very aware of who was at what location and who was hunting where. Nobody was supposed to be in the part one was at. Scared the crap out of me. This was mid-90s. Reason why I don't like hunting on public property is cause of that, and I don't know the people out there. When I was younger, I used to horseback around Northern California for weeks at a time. This was during the late 70s, early 80s. I rarely used a compass, but I always had a map of my area. I'm pretty good at dead reckoning via landmarks, and I've never been lost in my life. Except once. I was in the Six Rivers National Forest, heading south towards Trinity County. This is very rough terrain, lots of high ridges, steep hills, rocks everywhere, and nasty brush to tangle you. I was riding the ridges, heading generally south, and trying to find easy places to cross to the next ridge when it became convenient. The skies were partly cloudy, and it was cool, around 60 degrees Fahrenheit and cold for that time of year, since it was early August, and the temps were normally 90 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. I found a reasonable spot to cross over to the next ridge south of me and started down. When I got into the ravine, it turned out that what looked easy from above was actually a rocky nightmare. I started walking up the ravine to find an easier place to get out of there. A wind picked up, and it started drizzling. I walked for a mile or so, couldn't find anything that I wanted to risk my neck on, and more importantly, my horse's hooves, and decided to start up the side I had come down originally. I got to the top, took a look around to orient myself, and froze in shock. The landscape was completely different. I don't mean that it was lower or easier or less rocky. I mean that all of my landmarks were gone. Some of them were peaks that were 30 to 40 miles away, others were a lot closer. It was completely different. I had no idea where I was, and I was completely disoriented. I dug out my map and started to review where I was, the angles on the hills I had been navigating by earlier, etc. I couldn't find anything that matched. The only thing that I could positively identify was the route up from the ravine that I had just come up. Since it was cloudy, I couldn't navigate by the sun. All I had were the landmarks that I used for dead reckoning, and those were gone. The wind was picking up, and it was getting very, very cold. I almost expected snow. I had no idea where I was, so I decided to backtrack to my last known position and see if I could pick up where I left off. I started down the hill, got to the bottom of the ravine, and started the opposite direction up the ravine. This time I was very careful, watching for signs of my passage before and the hill I came down in the first place. It stopped raining, the wind died down, and the day started to warm up. I found my original trail down the hill, started back up, and got to the top. All the landmarks were there now. I was totally confused. I kept going on the ridge, watching carefully to find where I had come up before. When I got to the spot where I thought it should be, there was no sign of it. I cast back and forth for a while, trying to find my trail with no success. All of my landmarks were there to see. Eventually, I gave up and continued on the ridge. A bit later, I found an easy trail down and an easy trail back up the other side and continued on my way. To this day, I have no idea what happened. Even though it was drizzling, I should have been able to see the closer landmarks, and honestly, the further landmarks were big enough to see. To that point, thinking back on it, there was no sign that it was drizzling when I continued on to where I had ascended the first time. And the temperature swings were wild that day, easily 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Not uncommon in the mountains, but really odd for that time of year in that place. Another thing, originally, I had chosen to descend at that point because there was nothing to prevent me from going up the other side. I could see easily from the ridge top. But when I arrived, there were tons of boulders blocking me that I should have been able to see from top. Eerie and creepy. At the time, sure, but I was more focused on trying to orient myself. But thinking back on it, even more so now. I was with my brother-in-law. In the Appalachians, it's usually snowy in December, but that year it was a constant 40 degrees Fahrenheit or so, and too foggy to see very well. We made our way into a dense rainforest area and found what looked like an extremely overgrown, rarely trodden erosion forming a path. This didn't make sense. It was on the back of an inconvenient mountain peak, very craggy, and not on the way to anywhere, not even another trail. So we followed it. The deciduous canopy lay rotting on the winter ground, but little sunlight broke through anyway due to the deep fog and mountain shadow. It felt haunted. We descended into a hollow with a small creek at the bottom and rounded a bend into a dense clump of rhododendron. Inside this rhododendron brush, we started to see weird things like decaying rope, rusted metal, paracord, and supplies. Then the trail ended. Between two oak trees that formed a window through the brush, we could see a rusted body of metal with face-sized holes of glass on the sides. We made out the shape of a small plane from the scattered pieces. The body was only in two pieces, but the wings were unrecognizable. There was a bit of graffiti on the plane, but not as much as you would expect. It had clearly been there for a while, but some of the original gear was still in the body. I wrote down the number on the side for reference. When I got home, I googled the plane number and found a result. Accident report, March 1977, Western North Carolina. Damage beyond repair. 1 passenger. 1 fatality. Body recovered. Plane unsalvageable. We found the plane in 2016. That wreckage had been left to rot for 39 years, and some of the gear still had not been stolen. I know it was only 1 death, but that place had a deeply unsettling aura. I am not superstitious. I do not believe in ghosts, but there was something strange about that place, and I won't forget it. I didn't crawl into the plane's body, both out of fear and because I wanted to be respectful to whoever died there, but I did take pictures of it all from the outside. After helping my dad and brother quarter a big bull elk in the middle of nowhere, I went up the hill first because I had the lightest load. I figured I'd get my quarters to the top and then go back down and help my dad with the chest cavity. It had just stopped snowing, and while I was resting at the top of the hill, I glanced down and saw paw prints in the snow that had no snow in them. I knew based on the size it was either a wolf or mountain lion, but after looking closer I realized I just saw pads on the foot and not nails/claws making a mark in the front of the print. This meant I was definitely looking at the tracks of a big mountain lion who had been 50 yards from us as we worked on the elk. My dad was at the bottom of the hill. I had a front quarter on my back and a hind quarter on the sled I was pulling behind me, and no gun. I knew it was just 3 of us and I'd be around my dad the whole time, who was armed, so I didn't bring an additional firearm. I was a walking buffet standing right where the cat had been a few minutes before. There's no question he was looking at me. I calmly set the quarters down and made my way down to my dad. He agreed that I should have done what I did and even joked about it, saying at least our load won't be as heavy when we get back up there. I bet he took the front quarter. We got back up the hill and my quarters had been untouched, with no additional cat tracks around it. All 3 of us were paranoid as hell walking back the 2 miles to the truck, not knowing if at any moment the cat might decide he was hungry. We made it back home just fine and laughed about the whole thing as we were cleaning and butchering the elk. As a law enforcement ranger for 30 seasons, I have seen some dumb crap in the woods and some scary crap. My worst was chasing down a guy who had escaped from a mental treatment facility. If he was just camping in the deep woods, I wouldn't have had an issue with him, but he was routinely stealing the gusset out of women's and girls' swimsuits left to dry on lines in the campground and Girl Scout areas. The gusset, I'm told, is the cotton part of a suit that touches the outer labia and skin. It's like a cotton soft cloth sewed in for hygienic reasons, I was told. One of the Girl Scouts' moms came running up to me as I was on patrol and told me she had seen the man run off on foot from the clothesline, so I gave foot chase. This was in the days before our handheld radios could transmit further than back to the truck, so I had one of the older girls go make notification to my office, and like a dummy I took off running on the horse trail where I could see fresh prints. I ran about 2 miles or so and found a makeshift tent and campground setup. I also found cord and a linoleum knife and tape, along with Ziploc gallon-sized bags of these gussets. Clearly our thief was headed in a new direction. I'm convinced my intervention prevented an abduction. My guy came out of the woods and I drew my service sidearm for our walk back. I had him handcuffed and in leg irons with a leash drag so I could trip him by stepping on it. I also made him sing the Star-Spangled Banner as we ran to keep him out of breath if he decided to fight. When you're that far in the woods and unsure if you have help coming in, you have every advantage. My backup met us on the trail and we were able to handcuff our prisoner in the bed of the pickup for the ride to the office. I had to sit in the bed with him for the trip. He wasn't much of a chatter. The guys went back and cleaned out the site. He had been out there for a while and was definitely a bit of a time bomb. We didn't pursue anything criminal, but he was committed someplace in Ulster County, New York City, at a max security psych facility till his death. I used to put money on his commissary every now and again, but I doubt he remembered me. 3 years ago, I was hunting in Namaji State Forest in Amen. If you know anything about this area, there are wetlands everywhere, swamps and sinkholes litter the land. It's like nothing I've ever seen. This land is tough and mean, and if you go in unplanned and do not mark your way out, there's a good chance no one will ever see you again. It was a foggy morning in the second week of deer opener, and I was trailing along. I had my rifle across my chest with both hands on the scope and just trying to find an area where I could see more than 10 feet in front of me. The further in I realized I was lost, and then the holy crap set in. I walked a little further ahead trying to get my bearing, and before I knew it I stepped forward and sunk. I'm up to my forehead in mud and sinking, with my only anchor being my rifle, but in barrel that just so happened to be wider than the sinkhole I managed to get myself in. My only hope was to pull myself out, and I tried for 4.5 hours, screaming my lungs off for help and trying in vain to pull myself out, but every time I would pull up, my rifle would sink lower and lower, jumping up to yell and get a breath of air, then submerged in mud and sludge. After 5 hours, I came to terms that I was not getting out. I was going to die in a sinkhole, and no one would ever find me. I just thought about my wife and mom and how much it would hurt them to never find my body and go the rest of their lives without knowing what happened to me. I thought of my 2 girls and how I had wasted my life on a hunting trip, and that I was never going to be there for them anymore. And at that point, I think I probably looked like Leonardo DiCaprio from The Revenant, crawling through the snow. I was cursing and praying and cursing more, using my last bit of energy to get out. I thought, if I'm going to die, I'm going to make damn sure I exacerbate every fiber of my being before I entomb myself in this literal hellhole. Again, no luck, and out of nowhere this feeling of euphoria just rushed through my body. I was sad but happy at the same time, and understood it was my time to go. My body was broken. I was beginning to feel hypothermia set in, and out of nowhere I felt these 2 pair of hands grab mine that was still clenched to my rifle and slowly started getting pulled out of the sinkhole. A father and son had tracked a deer they shot to within 5 feet, to where I sank into. This day, that deer has made me feel like a god is out there, or it was my guardian angel. Where its life ended, I was reborn and given a second chance. And after the week in the hospital recovering from dehydration, hypothermia, and the ass-kicking I gave myself, I walked out of there promising myself to never take a second for granted. It's made me a better father to my children and a better man, I truly believe. I still wake up at night screaming with the rage I had, trying to pull myself up, sinking deeper and deeper, covered in sweat with my heart pounding. And when I do, I go check on my now 3 girls, and I just think to myself how lucky I am to be alive. And lastly, I have given up hunting or even going into deep woods. Maybe one day I will try again, but every time I think about it I just start shaking. Even writing this has had me in tears. On a side note, a man from the Twin Cities this last hunting season disappeared in the very same area I was hunting. Look it up if you don't believe me. And every time I would see his face on the news or in the paper, I could just imagine him in my head struggling to get out. But unfortunately for him and his family, he has still not been found. The only reason I am still here today was my rifle and how I held it across my chest.